Well, like in an abstract way, I remember thinking even as a little kid, and I think I'm not the only one to have this thought as a little kid that, artificial intelligence sort of seems like it might be the last profession, right? Because it can get.
Today, I talked to Lukas Biewald, the co-founder and CEO of Weights and Biases, an AI developer platform. We talk about large language models, his entrepreneurial journey, robotics, and developing tools for AI engineers. I hope you all enjoy. All right, all right. Thank you so much, Lucas, for coming into this podcast. Really, really appreciate your presence here. Um, it's really nice to see you here. And I wanted to start with your first startup, Figure Eight or Crowdflower. Um, I've read that Travis Kalanick, who is the founder of Uber and was the CEO for its most successful era, helped you achieve success there and help you with the seed round. What were the lessons that he taught you, and what did you learn from Travis, and how did he help you at the beginning?
Yeah, he was really helpful to me as kind of like a technical founder. I didn't really know anything about startups or fundraising, and back then there was a lot less resources for people who were kind of just starting out, especially as technical founders. Like back then, it was often common to, fire the technical founder or try to find some CEO who was non-technical. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned from Travis was to just really move with a sense of urgency. Like, everything he did, it was like time is the enemy of any deal. Like anything you're trying to do, just like rush the process, push the process. I think there's a real wisdom to that.
That I mean that's awesome. That's interesting. Can you describe a little bit more about how he helped you at the beginning? I mean, you mentioned having a sense of urgency at the beginning. That was like really really helpful. What other lessons have you learned from interacting with him early on?
It's been a while. One thing that he was very good at, I mean, sense of urgency was a big deal, right? So, like for example, to make it more specific, in a fundraising context, there's kind of a temptation to be like, hey, like let's wait and see, like let's like kind of test the waters. And Travis is kind of like, hey, either be all in on fundraising or not fundraising, which is kind of counterintuitive because you don't know how it's going to go. And so, I would go in with like much more confidence where it would be like, hey, we're going to fundraise by this date, we're gonna expect term sheets by this date. We're gonna value by this date. And that's easy to do if you feel like you have a strong hand, but it's really scary to do if you don't feel like you're strong hand and you don't feel like investors are gonna, be excited about what you have. So, he was really just hey, like go all in here, like completely commit to what you're doing. And it was funny because back then I didn't really have a lot of other people that I was talking to. I had a few, but Travis was spending the most time with me. And I didn't really realize that, I think now I see that he's like one of the most aggressive, CEOs out there, and kind of that's his style is to push with a sense of urgency. But I always sort of felt like, okay, man, I'm so passive. Like I'm never gonna be as aggressive as Travis and move at that level of urgency. But I think he's just actually a real outlier. But getting lessons from him and having him watch what I was doing, give me lots of feedback. I think it really did help me become a much better CEO.
Interesting. So I guess for your first startup, that was, I mean, you didn't have much experience, right, for Figure Eight, and you mentioned that that sense of urgency was applied. Did you apply that the first time around when you were raising your seed round, and did that help you? Would you recommend other people to do the same? How was that experience then? And did you change the way you approach fundraising?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to all of this. So, like, there are moments where you want to slow down, but I think when you're fundraising, especially early on, fundraising, when it's like kind of you're pitching more of an idea in yourself versus like revenue that you have, there's really no good reason for investors to not like kind of wait and see, right? And so, the frustrating experience I think of first time founders fundraising is often like, man, I just can't get people to actually like commit to anything. They're saying, yeah, like pretty cool. Why don't you come back later? Why don't you come back later? And, I think the thing that I learned, at the time was you gotta like cut through it and say, look, you gotta do it, by this date and you gotta really push people along. Like, I think like, following up like right away after every meeting, like, bugging people more than you feel comfortable. These things create a really good impression and it comes really naturally to some people, but I think it's like a technical guy that doesn't necessarily, come so naturally. So like, I think a lot about, momentum and like, how do we, just kind of keep moving forward. I take that, I take that lesson even now on, like launching a new product, like, hey, let's get it out. Let's try to get a few more users the next week and a few more users the next week. Like, Y Combinator talks a lot about like, 7% growth, week over week. And I think that's a really good way to do startups because when you move with a sense of urgency, everything goes faster and the iteration goes faster. And then, um, speed is kind of the only advantage you have as a startup, really.
And so let's say someone is fundraising right now. How do they define the dates that they are the due dates, for investors? Did you just have a sense of, look, I think I can raise money by November and I have 3 months. Like how do you set the dates for example, fundraising and even product launches?
Well, look, I think there's a real art to it. It depends on the situation, right? Because, you can come across as like a jerk, right? Just like, hey, you set a date and then you don't actually, do something by that date. But I think the bigger lesson of kind of push at every step, I think is really important. So I think like, really telling investors clearly, hey, I'm expecting to make a decision by this date. Can you meet that date? Is that a reasonable date for you? Because that's where other people are falling in. And then, following up and saying like, hey, we still tracking to this? I mean, that's just good execution for fundraising, good execution for sales, good execution for products, like kind of setting dates and like pushing on the dates and seeing if you can, pull things up. I think it's relevant for everything. And, time pressure is often clarifying, right? Like that's why MVPs work so well. It's like, what is the minimum set of things you need to have to get something in front of, customers? I think it's a really powerful thing because it forces you to focus on the things that are really important instead of spending time on things that are less important. So, in the product, I think really the benefit is focus. Of course, there are times to kind of slow down and think and be really deliberate. But then you got to flip back into pushing.
So, I mean, let's go back to when you started Figure Eight. So you started Figure Eight in 2007, right? And Figure Eight was started to help companies with data for machine learning, and that was back in 2007. I mean, you're a trendsetter, right? Like machine learning wasn't as big as it is today. Machine learning now, everyone talks about it. Did you have a sense of how big machine learning would get?
Well, like in an abstract way, I remember thinking even as a little kid, and I think I'm not the only one to have this thought as a little kid that, artificial intelligence sort of seems like it might be the last profession, right? Because if you can get computers to do something, you're kind of automating automation itself. And so I kind of dreamed of that as a kid. And I think artificial intelligence was interesting to me, because of that. Of course, then I went to grad school and saw that like there are very few really working applications of any type of artificial intelligence at the time. So there's sort of, disappointment there. But I think I was always kind of enamored with it and always had the sense that it would be kind of humanity's last project. And, and so, back in 2007, you saw a few applications like Google was really doing well off of, ranking, ads and ranking search results with machine learning and there's a little bit of recommendation systems out there. So you're kind of seeing it start to work in pockets. But it was a really different time. It was nowhere near as popular. I mean, to give an example, the way, I would deploy boosted trees at my first job was literally I had a program that would just compile, would you even call it compile? I don't know, just like lay out the trees in C code.
Oh,
And then I would
wow.
just run the C code, so I would just literally do like a whole bunch of go-tos in a tree structure and then execute it. It wasn't like there's any framework that would actually run the trees in production.
That's interesting. But I mean, so you started Figure Eight with the goal of helping companies collect data for machine learning. Was that a problem that you faced at the time, or how did the idea come about? And did you have a sense that this would become big this early on? Like, I mean, we're in 2024, but it seems that, machine learning grew really, really fast, at least in the last 10 years, even though it's been, in sci-fi. If you're a fan of sci-fi, there's Asimov, and like it wasn't clear in 2007 that this was going to be big. Did you have a sense of the problem, or how did the idea come about at the time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I really needed training data. I think I first felt, in grad school trying to do research that all the research was oriented around places where there happened to be training data. So there was the European Union would put out um, its proceedings in every European Union language. So like all the translation systems were based on this European Union corpus. So it would translate. It thought like cabinet was like the president's cabinet, like not the furniture cabinet, and it even would think like plant was the power plant sets of plant typically versus like the living plant, just because like the vagaries of the particular corpus that everybody was training on. So that drove me nuts, right? Because I was like, there's so many like useful things we could be doing, but we're totally held back by training data. And then, in my first job, I was kind of realizing, these algorithm improvements are so much smaller than the improvements of getting more training data. In fact, you should probably fire all the machine learning engineers and hire more annotators, because that's like really where the improvements are going to come from. So I had a strong sense in the applications that I was working in that training data is critically important. At the time, not a lot of people agreed with that. Like I remember even Travis kind of telling me, "Hey man, like take that, machine learning training data thing out of your pitch because it just sounds like, a science project or science fiction and investors aren't going to like it." And it wasn't until the 2010s at least where you started to see companies get funded for primarily machine learning applications.
Did you remove it from your pitch, or?
Yeah, well, it was the early ones, then it wasn't working, and so I took it out, and it's like, well, this is sort of like tasks that we're doing, and those tasks just happen to be, training data collection primarily.
So investors didn't realize how important this would become at the time. So I mean, you were a little bit ahead of your time, I guess.
Yep,
Um,
for sure.
awesome. So, I mean, on figure eight, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced when you had your first startup? It's your first experience starting the company with co-founder Chris. Is that right?
That's right.
Um, like, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in your first startup? Was it fundraising? Was it managing people? What what kind of challenges did you face?
Yeah, I mean, look, fundraising was really hard. It kind of took years to raise money. I think that might have been actually healthy for us because it caused us to go out and really learn how to do sales to enterprises. Like you know, I think founders these days are too scared to sell to enterprises as a small company, and I think it's totally possible. And if I could do it, anyone could do it. I think that managing people was a real challenge. I really had no experience in that, and suddenly, found myself hiring and managing a lot of people. I think there was an effect then. Again, I think this isn't as the case so much now, but that whole thing of like, 0 to 1 being different than scaling wasn't really in the zeitgeist, or at least I hadn't heard of it. So, when I was starting to build out the company, I was getting a lot of advice from people that had scaled companies. And the advice is by and large terrible, right? Like, the salesperson that does your first couple deals, totally different than the salesperson you want kind of like running a scaled out team. And the advice is almost like opposite in a lot of cases. Like you want to do things that don't scale until you want to do things that scale. And so, I think I got into mode where I really wasn't trusting a lot of, good advice that was out there because so much of it felt like it didn't apply to the early success that I was having, that it took me too long to realize when it did apply and when we were in a scaling mode that I should be doing more scaling oriented things, because I kind of felt like, all this like process and meeting stuff is just a bunch of BS that's like slowing people down. And like we're winning because we're like avoiding process and we're avoiding meetings. So we're just like cranking here and like, um, you know, uh, so that made me like, I think a really bad manager, for a long time before, I kind of really felt the the pain that comes from having everything in a really chaotic um, mode. I mean, also the market was tough, right? Like, you know, we got a couple early wins, like selling to like Google and eBay and others, but then there weren't a lot of companies really doing machine learning. So market size really was an issue. Like I was kind of right in Silicon Valley working in machine learning. So I saw all the companies that you could sell to, but outside of Silicon Valley, hardly anyone was doing machine learning until the mid 2010s. And so, we
Mhm.
kind of got off to a fast start and then, hit a wall, which is a really tough thing for any company to go through, right? Like usually when growth stops, it's very uncommon for growth to reignite.
Interesting. And did you see the growth pick up again later on for Figure Eight? And
Yeah.
what was the trigger for the growth of Figure Eight?
Yeah, the big trigger was vision algorithms starting to work and that causing a real interest in especially self-driving cars. So, in the early days of Figure Eight, we really sold to a lot of e-commerce, like recommendation systems was like a big business for us. And then some early NLP tech stuff to like financial institutions that wanted to process lots of documents. But those markets were smaller than the autonomous vehicle market, which just kind of took off, and everyone was like in a big rush, needed tons of labeled data to do these deep learning algorithms. And so suddenly the demand just dramatically increased.
Interesting. And how did you approach that wall? Like, how did you deal with that with the team, and what happened there? How was that experience? Because I mean, in my experience, I was at Facebook when Facebook launched mobile, and it was right after the IPO, and people were making fun of Mark Zuckerberg. And now you know, Facebook's such now Meta is such a big company, and I've seen companies face challenges every now and then. How do you approach that, and would you recommend people that like have that experience of approaching such a problem like hitting a wall?
Well, I don't know if there's one way. It's sort of like how do you approach doing a startup? Like it's hitting a wall is tough. I mean, it's incredibly painful. Everything I know that's gone through it, leaves like psychological scars. Because when you're leading a company, um, the success or failure, you're so invested in it with your ego, and you kind of personify it for your employees. So just as you're like feeling bad about yourself that the growth isn't happening, at the same time, like everybody's mad at you because they feel like you promised them this growth, and you're not being successful by definition as a leader of a startup if you're not growing. So, people are telling you, hey, you're failing. Everyone has a different idea of, what you should be doing. So people, will tell you that you're not like articulating a clear vision. They'll tell you, you're not like leading in a good way. Like every kind of flaw, people suddenly become very comfortable telling you at the same time, like your board is questioning you. So, you need like, first of all, like a lot of just like psychological resolve and tenacity to get through it. I mean, there's a lot of perks to being a CEO founder, but it's really psychologically hard to go through growth flatlining. I don't know. I've never been close to any CEO that's happened to that didn't really suffer through that, even though that suffering is nowhere near compared to, lots of people on earth. I think it is a real painful psychological experience. And I think, we were successful because we stuck it out. And, not everyone that sticks it out is successful. We just kind of kept going and going and going and tried a lot of things that didn't work. And then stayed open minded to, what we were seeing out there. And I think it was really my co founder, Chris, that kind of jumped on. He built, I remember, a labeling tool for semantic segmentation that was suddenly incredibly popular. And that really kind of turbocharged our growth there.
Interesting. And then you end up selling the company. Can you tell us a little bit of the process of why did you sell the company, and the process of the sale, right?
Sure. It was a long process. Like um, we were in kind of a tough moment a few years earlier. Where we tried to sell the company and basically, no one wanted to buy it. And so, we basically went to potential acquirers and kind of openly asked like, hey, are you interested in buying it? Got a few yeses and then, um, one, one company, Appen, which is an Australian company that was kind of in the same business, um, gave us a good offer. And then it was like, one of the most stressful, maybe even more stressful period of my life. It's sort of like, you kind of can't tell everyone in the company this is going on. So, I really like to be like open and honest with people, but it kind of like, even maybe like not answering a question feels like a signal. So you're just trying to like navigate that like ethically and like openly and honestly is tough. And people are very like stressed around me, right? Because they know that maybe change is coming, and so I was really relieved when the sale finally went through.
That's awesome. That's really interesting. Yeah. So I mean, you sold Figure Eight, and then eventually went to start Weights and Biases with one of your former co-founders, Chris Van Pelt.
Mhm.
How did your experience on Figure Eight shape your approach on founding Weights and Biases, and and why did you end up starting Weights and Biases? What prompted you to start Weights and Biases?
Well, one thing was we added a third co-founder, Sean, who we had known for a long time, and we we were kind of thinking what would be a company that we wanted to spend the rest of our lives on. I think, once you're like 12 years into a startup, you kind of realize that like, startup is not like a get rich quick scheme. It's like, we're like, okay, we maybe have like one more startup in us. Um, what would we want that to be? And so I think we approached it from maybe more a place of like intrinsic um interest. And we were much more intentional about our customer base. So we really were like, we want to build a company around this kind of AI engineer persona versus like a specific thing that we want to build. So,
Hmm.
we're like, okay, we want to spend the rest of our lives going to conferences like, NeurIPS and CVPR and like talking to people that are kind of like building the future of AI. And so, we want to serve them with things that are going to be valuable for them. And we also thought, we don't want to make an unsuccessful company. Like that's like our nightmare. So it's like, how does that make a good business? And we thought, well, these people are more and more valuable inside their companies. They might not have a lot of budget now, but surely that budget is going to grow. And so we really focus on making something that would serve this particular audience well. And then I mean, Sean really has like brilliant ideas of, things that are going to work as like, as tools for this audience. And so, a lot of the early stuff we built actually worked really well, but we were kind of ready for it to take a lot longer.
Interesting. I've used Weights and Biases, and I can tell that
Nice.
it's one of my favorite products. I train text to speech model using PyTorch three
Oh,
years
love it.
ago, and I mean it was recommended by a friend who worked at OpenAI, and it's such a great product. It's just a one line, addition, and also the customer support is amazing. I think Chris answer some of my issues. I don't remember if it was on GitHub or where I submitted issues, but I remember being like, you guys being awesome.
Thank,
Uh,
thank you.
so yeah, I mean, thank you for making such a great product. Um, so like let's dive in a little bit more into Weights and Biases. So you had the experience on Figure Eight, and on how to start a company. What lessons did you learn and apply when you started Weights and Biases? Are there any lessons that you've learned and apply at the beginning on fundraising, hiring, and things like that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the thing that matters the most by far is that you make a product that people want. And I think like Y Combinator talks about that, and a lot of people talk about it as like obvious, right? But I think that people, even knowing that, they don't take it seriously enough. So I think just completely focusing on like, okay, are we making something that people actually want? It's harder to do than it looks. Everything else is kind of like noise, or needs to like really serve that directly. So that was like 100% of our focus. I mean, I think companies talk about like, I think first time founders sometimes talk about like PR or values or like, all these things. And they just they do matter eventually, but they don't matter if the product doesn't work. So um yeah, we were just completely focused on that. And then the fundraising is different as a second time founder. It's a lot easier. And I think the fundraising climate has gotten easier. So, that was like less of an issue for us. But I think I was less like sometimes like I think especially first time founders can get this mode of like your valuation is like your report card and you want to get the highest possible valuation. And I would like encourage founders to do that. I mean, VCs complain about valuation. I think that also is ridiculous. But I think I worried about the exact valuation number less than I worried in the past and maybe spent a little less time on like making the perfect pitch deck. And more just like, hey, let's make a product that works. Like let's have like a clear mission here. And then also, early hiring, it's just like it matters so much to get the best people. You probably want to interview a lot more people, than you think before you pull the trigger on making offers.
Interesting. So I've talking about hiring, I've read an article that you wrote in 2014 about how hiring is one of the only decisions that's consensus based. And
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot of people say consensus based decisions are not the best ones. Like, have you approached hiring differently from consensus? If so, how so? And do you have any recommendations on hiring the best? And what kind of things do you think do well?
Well, I think one thing that people don't do is really reflect on past hiring decisions. I think this is one thing that's really important that people hardly ever do. So, I always I have a spreadsheet of every hire I made and, a score on scale of 1 to 4. It's pretty basic. Like 1 is like, I would never ever work with them again. 2 is like, I wouldn't try to hire them. 3 is like, I would hire them again. And 4 is like, I would like kill to work with this person. So simple scale. It's pretty clear to me where everybody like falls in that, scale. It's only for me, right? A lot of people are successful working for other people and not me. And then I think about, okay, well, what did I know at the time that I hired them. I mean, you know, um, I even, talked to my coworkers about this. Like my VP of engineering, is like, hey, I don't like the way you're like interviewing engineers. It's a little bit too much like kind of Google style, like puzzle stuff. It's not really like relevant for for the job. And so we looked and we looked at all the hires we made and we looked at how we scored them, and we always keep a record of that. And his scores are actually more correlated with success than my scores. There were a couple where I gave someone a 2 and he like overruled me and they were very good. And so yeah, you know what? Like that's really good information and that caused me to adjust the way that I interview people. So I think viewing hiring as a process of like continuous improvement is really, really important and not like forgetting, like writing down like what you actually scored someone, how everybody scored them. But I am a real delegator in the hiring process. So, everyone's got to give a score, but then the hiring manager is the one that gets to decide, yes or no. And there's not a rule. Like, you know, you can hire someone that somebody gave a 2 or even a 1, but you're gonna have to face the consequences there. And I think sometimes when somebody gets like all threes, that can be a bad sign. Like I really want to see, I kind of prefer candidates that, get like 2s and 4s on our scale of 1 to 4 than someone that gets all threes. In my experience, those people tend to do better.
And have you seen any patterns in like how are some people better in assessing someone's, probably future performance, or is your intuition like, I mean, you mentioned that, for example, Google style interviews didn't necessarily do as well as, your VP. Like what kind of approaches or what kind of learnings have you learned besides the foreign tools? Do you think intuition matters? What do you think matters as well?
Yeah, I think intuition matters a lot. I mean, I think for me, actually, every time I go back through the scores, I feel like I should probably pay more attention to my intuition because I really like to be able to like articulate clearly, like, what I liked about someone and didn't like. And I don't like these things of like, it's a good culture fit. That seems like, I don't know, that seems a little wrong to me. Like, I want the person who's going to come in and do the best at the job. Like that,
Mhm.
like, kind of what I rationally think. At the same time, though, some of my best hires, if you look at like what I'm saying in the thing, it's like I just really like them. I just something, inside of me like really like believed in them. And so I kind of went for it and, said, hey, I think we should hire this person, even though it doesn't quite make sense on paper. Um, so like intuition, like certainly um plays a role. I also think like setting up interviews well for me is really important. I actually learned this from my wife. Like she really does project-based interviews for like every kind of role that she hires for. And I was kind of feeling like, I'm much better hiring engineers than non-engineers. And I realized, with engineers, you really take the project seriously. And at least in my company, I had not been taking it seriously for like non-engineering roles. And that was like a wake-up call to me that, and actually I learned more from the experience of kind of working with somebody on something than, asking them questions. And I think it could be a style thing. I think like, different people have different styles that work for them, but project-based things really work for me.
Yeah, I've seen a trend of some companies doing a test of like 3 months and with new engineers, and that's mostly project based. And I mean, you're basically figuring out within a little bit more information if that person is going to work out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, weights and biases is providing tooling for AI engineers, and most of them are developing neural networks, right? And they present unique challenges. I mean, I've used your tool and then I've experienced some of these unique challenges. How would you describe the challenges what are the different challenges that developing neural networks present compared to just developing the traditional sort of software?
What? From you? You did it.
I I mean, what one of the challenges I think is, I mean, it's not clear that you achieve what you wanted to achieve. I mean, you have error rates and things like that. You have data drift. You don't necessarily, until you try it out, you don't know if it's working well. And even when you try it out, sometimes you don't have the full experience. So you actually have, to gather feedback, and sometimes the feedback's not correct. But I mean, you're developing software to help, engineers figure out these error rates and things like that, train these different neural networks. I don't know if you have any insight there.
Yeah, I mean, we think a lot about this. First we thought about it when we started the company because it was like, why do um, AI engineers need different tools than software developers? And lately we've been thinking about it because, a lot of our new users are just using LLMs or foundation models for some purpose and not even, modifying them. And so, I think what's fundamentally different about doing AI development is that it's an experimental workflow versus a kind of iterative workflow. And what I mean by that is like with software, you're typically like adding things and you are like trying to run the code, but you mostly kind of add functionality and you kind of predict what that functionality is going to be and see how well it works for most types of software development. I think like growth hacking and a few other things actually have more similarities to AI development than software development. But kind of the typical, building web app, building a library, you're kind of adding, functionality. Whereas with AI development, you're mostly trying things and testing them, and most things you try don't work, right? So it's a very different kind of like version control happening where, in software development, you're trying to keep like merging things back into main, you branch a little bit, you go back. Whereas like in AI development, I feel like you're actually making way, way more branches, right? Like, in fact, people don't typically, make a branch for every prompt that they try, for every like, you know, um, agent setup that they do, or, for every set of hyperparameters. But really, I think that it's like this unit of learning that happens each time you do it. So I think like weights and biases about at a really high level is keeping track of like all those learnings that happen in this experimental workflow. And that's, I think, why it's like valuable for people both using LLMs and the people building those very same LLMs can kind of use the same set of tools because they're both iterating and experimenting and trying to learn things and keep track of that knowledge base.
I mean, you mentioned in your first company that you hit a wall, and then eventually, you know, ImageNet, there was ImageNet, there was, more software that was, there was ImageNet where people could try it out, and deep learning started picking it up, and, segmentation, things like that did really well. But eventually now we have, ChatGPT, which, was the explosion of usage. And now we see a lot of more companies applying large language models, but AI has become a buzzword, right? How did the release of ChatGPT affect the adoption of weights and biases? And do you think the adoption of most companies will come in the future, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't ever have like one day where there's like suddenly 5 times as many users. Like what we've seen at Weights and Biases is just kind of like steady growth over the whole period of time we've been doing it. And I actually think if you look at the performance of a typical AI model in any field, we like tell ourselves these stories of like breakthroughs, right? Like, like
But
AlexNet and like, like ResNet.
AlphaGo,
Yeah, yeah. But actually if you look at like performance on a benchmark, like uh audio transcription, it's honestly like very steady, over like
yeah.
decades. It just gets better and better and better every year. And then suddenly we kind of wake up and we're like, wow, this went from like really bad to really good. And so I think that it's a little bit of a cognitive like illusion, right? Because, there were actually several versions of GPT. I mean, GPT-3 was out and people weren't really using it, right? Because it was like inside the API. But then when they put it in a chat mode, then there was sort of an explosion of excitement. Because I think it just finally, got above a bar where it was like easy enough to use and fun and like useful. And there's lots of adoption. And so I think we just see more and more users every quarter, every week, every year. And I expect that to continue because I think it's really coming from Moore's law, right? And Moore's law somehow is this like almost feels like this law of physics, right? Like as the compute price goes down, people find ways to use it somehow. And we keep thinking it's gonna run out, but it just somehow doesn't. And somehow we find ways to take advantage of like more compute with like bigger data sets, bigger models, to do more and more things. And so I think the more powerful the software gets, the more people are gonna take advantage of it, and then more companies will adopt it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I wrote a book about, AI and things like that. And I have a graph of, Go engines over time. And you can clearly see, the evolution over time. And I mean, when there's some software improvement, there is a little bit of improvement. So, you had like tree search, and then you add, some probabilistic models there, and then there's a jump, and then, you add deep learning on top of the tree search. And so it gets a little bit better, but it's like very clear that, there's a trend line, and you see with like, GPTs over time. But it's interesting that there was like so much excitement all of a sudden with ChatGPT. Um, but I mean, you see a lot of applications across, you know, your usage. I imagine, from self-driving cars to, even OpenAI, Microsoft Meta. What are some of the most interesting applications that you've seen with neural networks, and what do you think are the most interesting applications in the future?
I mean, LLMs are like incredibly cool, right? So maybe I'll go for some underrated, applications. So I think one, place is sort of like physics and material science, right?
Yeah.
So I think people are surprised how much breakthroughs we're seeing in that right now. And I mean, in material science and the chemistry especially, drug discovery is like I think finally really, really working and sort of table stakes for every pharma company at this point that wants to do their own drug discovery. And that's really exciting because that's like curing like real diseases that people really have. And then there's like other healthcare applications on top of that that I think are really um, powerful. Um, I guess I tend to love the physical stuff. Like I think the ag tech things and like satellite data processing is really incredible, and you can really, touch and feel it. I think manufacturing has some surprising ways that it's getting better and better using, you know, deep learning, maybe foundation models soon. But I think the really extraordinary thing actually is that it touches every industry that like, yeah, these days we consider every company in the Fortune 500 inside our addressable market. We think they have at least, 10 AI engineers and therefore, you know, could become a real enterprise customer of weights and biases.
I really want the future to come, with flying cars, nanobots, nuclear fusion, and
And it seems like all those things are coming, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, nuclear fusion. I'm very, very excited about nuclear fusion, and the only thing that I don't see as much innovation is with like specific. I mean, you mentioned material science, but I mean, I don't see it as much in the news of, like nanotechnology and things like that. And I think that's going to be very interesting. One of the things that I find it very interesting, there's like this curve called Adam's curve, which is like the energy output of humans and kind of stagnated, I think. And it may be because of regulation, it may be just because of lack of innovation. But now with solar panels and nuclear fusion, it seems that we're probably gonna produce a lot of cheap energy that's gonna be good for society, and so we may have flying cars. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's gonna be very interesting, and I want to switch to one of I also really love this topic. I know you like that as well, robotics. So, um, I mean, I went to MIT and I studied with, Minsky was, one of, he was more into the software part of it, neural networks and things like that. But, you had Rodney Brooks, who started iRobot, um, and, you had, Baxter, eventually. But robotics hasn't exploded as much, in the world that we see. There's robots obviously in manufacturing, Kika robots and things like that. Um, how do you think like what's the future of robotics in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think we're right at the verge of robotics? I mean, Tesla obviously they have, you know, robots driving around, and Waymo now self-driving cars. Like, what do you think is the future of robotics in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think there's going to be an explosion of robots, right? I mean, I think that we can build robots with the capability to do lots of interesting things that we care about, but it's hard to give them the intelligence to reliably do those things. But once they get that sort of general intelligence, it's cheap to copy that model in lots of places and run it. So I think there's tons of applications. It just again, it hasn't kind of quite gotten over the um over line where it's reliable enough to be useful. And it's probably a little bit further away. Yeah, we think if you look at you know, I mean a lot of these companies actually do have like unbelievable demos now where it's hard to say, but it looks like, the robots are hitting unforeseen obstacles, like braking in different ways and sort of able to still recover and do useful things because they're using more deep learning or reinforcement learning algorithms to be much more reliable with cheaper hardware. And I feel like, self-driving cars got a lot of initial excitement maybe back in 2015 and 2016. And then people were complaining, hey, this is taking forever. Like this is all hype. But here we are in 2024. I ride a Waymo all the time. It works fantastically well. And clearly it's about to get copied to, every city around the world because it's a phenomenal experience. And and I think the Waymo is a little held back by the needing really detailed maps of cities that they operate in, but
Yeah.
robots don't have such limitations. So I have a feeling that there will be an absolute explosion of robots. Yeah, maybe not next year or two, but in the next 5 to 10 years for sure.
Yeah, I haven't tried the Tesla FS, the latest beta version, the 12.3, but apparently it's also really, really great. And, it works in different areas, which is very interesting. And
Totally.
I agree with you. It's kind of interesting because now we were seeing another hype wave of AI, but now it's not self-driving cars, it's, chatbots and things like that. And I think, I mean, we're talking a lot about agents already, and I don't think we're ready for agents just yet. And it might be, 5 years out, like self-driving cars were back then, and there was this huge wave. But there are like some interesting companies, including Coma, Tesla, and Waymo, and that's like super interesting. Um, yeah, I'm really excited about that. Um, so I mean, ML practitioners, they use a lot of they use weights and biases, to experiment and train neural networks. Are there obvious areas that they can, improve in the way they train their models that you've seen, using weights and biases, and where they can improve?
Really basic thing is that we're pulling stats on this, but you know, people almost never saturate all the RAM they have in their GPU, um, which is kind of silly, right? It sort of seems like you should find a way to do that, like use a bigger batch size or use a bigger model. So I think people tend to underutilize um, their hardware resources. I think people also tend to not do hyperparameter searches in a very principled way, which I totally understand, but if you really are looking for the best set of hyperparameters to get that last, I don't know, like 10% of performance, um, yeah, you might as well use, Bayesian optimization or some, kind of more principled exploration of the space that you're in. Um, but a lot of this is application dependent too. I mean, I think probably the best things you could do is look at types of errors that your models are making and go out and try to find data that fits that kind of error. But I think this field is moving so fast that nobody has time to try every useful thing that might be out there. And then the situation is even more acute with using LLMs, right? Like I think a lot of the automatic prompting strategies are unbelievably effective at this moment. Maybe they'll go away with new versions of LLMs that are sort of less sensitive to the particular framing of the prompts, but um, you know, a lot of the kind of prompt mutator DSPY strategies that are out there work super well, but they're really new. There's not like reliable implementations of them, but if people spend a few days doing it, they can get much better performance.
I mean, there was a huge change with, the type of neural networks. You had transformers being applied, mostly for language models. They might be applied to, vision models. You have like diffusion models for generating images. Do you see any trends in the future or any bottlenecks that, a new kind of software architecture will be applied in the future, or any kind of trends there?
I don't know. I mean, right now it feels like transformer architecture is so ubiquitous that I feel like people are still kind of consolidating around that. I mean, you see like a lot of variants that people are experimenting on. You see like diffusion models applied to um more domains, but I don't want to be like spying on all of our customers approaches. And so, this is really just from talking to our customers and asking them what they're trying and what's working.
And in terms of trends, so for example, Hugging Face yesterday, I think they released a dashboard of like the top performing neural language models, and they change based on their benchmark. So I think the Chinese one performed the best. What kind of trends globally do you see in terms of development of neural networks, large language models? Do you see a lot of development in China or elsewhere, or is it still mostly in the US?
No, we're pretty global. I mean, we see like our user base is about a third North America, a third Europe, and a third Asia,
Oh,
with a little bit of Africa and almost no South America. So, it's a pretty global thing, probably more than people realize. And I think, I don't think people in other countries are content to, um, let like Silicon Valley like make all the foundation models. And obviously like Mistral's been incredibly successful.
yeah, it's
Um,
awesome to see.
Yeah, it's awesome to see, and it's awesome to see. I mean, I think it's pretty cool to that some of these Chinese models can work better in English than US based models. I think this competition is really healthy and good. Like it doesn't seem like any one company is really running away with it. Um, I think it's actually I think the AI development now is more international than I ever remember it being.
Interesting. And I mean, I'm just very curious about that because you mentioned a third of in Europe. Are there a bunch of startups forming there? I mean, obviously there's Mistral, and then I don't know if you include Israel in Europe, and I know Dubai has a bunch of startups that are developing
Yeah.
large language models. But in terms of the adoption, are there a lot of startups, or are these companies that are based or have employees in Europe?
We see quite a lot of both. There's a lot of interesting startups. Europe, Middle East for sure. Um, but then I think I think most large European companies use AI just like most large American companies. Um, use AI. They I think Europeans tend to be um, more concerned about data privacy issues and maybe a little more cautious about technology choices, but they're still certainly using AI.
So let's look 5 years, that 10 years ahead. What do you think? Weights and biases obviously is going to keep serving the AI engineer, but how do you think weights and biases will evolve over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we're gonna keep serving the AI engineers, and that's our mission, and that's what we plan to keep doing. I have a feeling it'll probably evolve in really surprising ways, right? Like, we never would have predicted a lot of the stuff that we've built recently. I mean, I think agents are coming in a big way, and I think it really changes the workflow. I mean, maybe even who's an AI engineer changes, right? Like we see lots of software developers turning into AI engineers. Maybe everyone can turn into an AI engineer somehow if it's really just like agents that are kind of building the AI and the engineering is just telling the agents what you want.
I've heard a quote by Jensen Huang, and I had the idea a little bit in my head, but I think he really nailed it. Um, he mentioned the next language that people program is natural language. I mean, when you talk to these chatbots, you're using natural language. And the way we talk to robots right now is mostly, now it's a little bit more advanced. So maybe people use JavaScript, TypeScript. In the past, it was like bytecode. And so we evolved over time, right? And it's kind of interesting that eventually we'll have agents, more and more so we'll have agents, and we'll interact with these agents with natural language. So I think that's like really interesting. And, these neural networks are, oh, I mean, when we're talking to them, we are also kind of programming them. I mean, it's a different kind of programming, right? When you're training the neural networks, you are also programming, you're training the brain, kind of these machines. But it's kind of an interesting take. Awesome. So this was an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. Where can people find you online, and where can people find about weights and biases? Again, I think it's the best product in the market. It's like really awesome. It's just a one line, and then you can use, if you're using PyTorch or whatever to train your neural network. You can actually track experiments and things like that. So where can people find you online and find more about weights and biases?
I'm L2K on Twitter. And we find weights and biases at W&B.com. And I should say that the new product in there is called Weave, which is all around people doing Gen AI and using LLMs. So I'd especially encourage people to give our new product a try because I think most ML engineers have used weights and biases at this point, but I think there's a whole new cohort of AI engineers that are hoping will adopt Weave.
Can you describe a little bit more about Weave and how can it help engineers?
Sure. So this is like also a one-liner. I mean, that's one thing we learned is to make the integration really simple. And then, you can see traces around, all of your calls to various LLMs. You can set up evaluation frameworks where you can try using different LLMs or, using different strategies, prompt strategies and others. And you can also, it gives you APIs and an interface to quickly annotate your results or collect feedback from your users by essentially having them annotate the results.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucas, for your time. Really, really appreciate it. I know um, how little time you have as a CEO and, really, really appreciate. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend and enjoy.
Thank you.